My name is Joanna Lemley. I am a wetland ecologist with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. The following presentation will cover half of the concepts needed to classify and describe riparian and wetland monitoring plots. You can follow along in section 5.1 and associated appendices in the field protocol for lentic riparian and wetland systems. This video, which is part 1, will include the general steps outlined in section 5.1 of the protocol, and will go into detail on the Cowardin classification. Part 2 of the presentation, in a separate video, will cover the hydrogeomorphic classification, general wetland types, and how the three classifications tie together. Riparian and wetland areas occur in a variety of landscape settings. Classification aids in data interpretation because it ensures that similar sites are compared. Classification can also help understand potential conditions. For example, expected cover of bare ground would be much higher in a playa than in a fen or wet meadow. Classification ensures we are comparing apples to apples and not oranges. There are three main steps to section 5.1 of the protocol. These are all recorded on the plot characterization form along with details about the plot layout. The first is to record the elevation, slope, and aspect of the monitoring plot. The second is to classify the monitoring plot by 3 different classification systems. And third is to describe the plot in words and with an illustration. Elevation, slope, and aspect are all fundamental characteristics of a monitoring plot, and they can affect species composition, sun exposure, soil moisture regime, and many other factors. In the field, elevation can be determined using your GPS, tablet, a US geographic topographic map, or other information sources. It should be recorded in meters. Slope should be determined using a clinometer, which we will demonstrate during field training. Slope is recorded in percent rather than degrees. To measure slope, consider the entire monitoring plot, not slight changes in microtopography that might occur within the plot. Aspect is determined using a compass, which we will also demonstrate in the field. Aspect is measured in degrees using magnetic north rather than true north. Do not adjust the compass for declination. Magnetic north is less prone to error than adjusting for declination at every plot. Measure the aspect of the slope facing downslope in the direction that water would flow across the plot. Like slope, think about the plot as a whole and not small changes in aspect within the plot. If the plot has a slope less than 1%, record aspect as NA, because the site is essentially flat and has no aspect. The next step is to classify the monitoring plot by 3 major classification systems. First, the Cowardin classification system used by the National Wetlands Inventory Mapping Program. Second, the hydrogeomorphic, or HGM classification system. And third, a general wetland type, which includes standard recognized names for riparian and wetland areas. I will go through each classification system in detail on the following slides. For each classification designation, also record the level of confidence. Some monitoring plots will fit the class descriptions perfectly, and there is no ambiguity. Others may seem to have properties of more than one class. Rather than actual apples and oranges, ecological systems exist on continuums rather than in clear boxes. While the ends of those continuums may clearly fit one type or another, you will find that some monitoring plots land in the gray area along the continuum. The confidence ratings allow field crews to record any ambiguity in classifying the plot. There is also a comment box to record notes on the classification. Notes are not necessary if the classification is straightforward, but are helpful for lower confidence ratings. This slide shows the classification section of the plot characterization Survey 123 form. Lastly, describe the major characteristics of the monitoring plot in words. This is your chance to tell the story of the monitoring plot and the riparian or wetland site in which it is located. The plot description should be a short paragraph and should include the following information: the wetland type, the landscape position, dominant vegetation, general hydrology, a brief summary of the hydrology is fine, soil type, and major land uses or disturbances. The example description shown here contains all the elements we are looking for. I will give you a moment to read the description yourself. Along with a written description, draw a rough sketch of the plot on the drawing sheet. We recommend drawing this sheet on paper and uploading a photo into Survey123. Colored pencils can be used to indicate different vegetation communities across or surrounding the plot. The plot drawing should be approximately to scale and should include the following elements: a north arrow, transect lines with starts and ends labeled A and B, locations of the soil pit and any water chemistry samples, flow paths and channels, and any other prominent features in or surrounding the plot. The rest of this presentation will be about the three major classification systems used in the field protocol for riparian and wetland systems. The first two, the Cowardin classification and the hydrogeomorphic or HGM classification system, are standard wetland classification systems used across the country. The third is based loosely on the ecological systems classification developed by NatureServe, the umbrella over all natural heritage programs. Each of these classification systems is explained in more detail in an appendix of the protocol. This table compares the three classification systems, including the resource the system was developed for, the primary drivers that differentiate classes within the system, and some example terminology. The Cowardin classification was developed in the 1970s by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the National Wetland Inventory Program, which maps all wetlands and deepwater habitats in the United States. As such, the resources the system was developed for include all wetlands and water bodies like lakes and rivers. A separate supplement to the classification also includes drier riparian areas. The primary drivers of this hierarchical classification are water body first, then vegetation structure, then hydroperiod or water regime. Some examples of terminology used in each level in the hierarchy includes the words lacustrine, riverine, palustrine, emergent, scrub-shrub, forested, seasonally flooded, permanently saturated, and many more. The hydrogeomorphic or HGM classification was developed in the 1990s in an effort to tell a little more about how wetlands fit in the larger landscape, particularly in terms of geomorphology and water flow. These factors are often more connected to ecological functions and services, meaning what the wetland does in the landscape, rather than simply knowing if it is herbaceous or woody. The HGM classification system was developed just for wetlands and not water bodies. It can also be extended to drier riparian areas. The primary drivers of the classification are geomorphology, water source, and hydrodynamics. Some examples of terminology include lacustrine fringe, riverine, slope, depression, flat. Lastly, a general wetland type is assigned. These are words or phrases that are easily recognizable by most people familiar with wetland systems. This classification system was loosely adapted from the ecological systems classification, which includes all natural vegetation communities. The primary drivers are vegetation structure and composition, as well as abiotic factors. Some examples of terminology include riparian shrubland, wet meadow, marsh, fen. But watch out. The same words don't always mean the same thing in these classifications, which I will explain as we go along. You will notice that the words lacustrine and riverine show up in both the Cowardin and the HGM classifications. While they both have the same root meanings, lacustrine refers to lakes and riverine to rivers, the exact uses of the words are different in the two systems. Similarly, the term riparian shows up in the supplement to the Cowardin classification for drier riparian areas, but it does not exactly match the meaning in the term riparian shrubland. As we go, I will point out these differences to prevent confusion. A bit of background on the Cowardin classification and the National Wetland Inventory, or NWI program. NWI is a program of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It began in the 1970s with the goal of mapping wetlands and water bodies across the United States and tracking changes over time. The program was developed in the era of the Clean Water Act, when the nation began to understand the impact of environmental and habitat destruction. Early work by the National Wetlands Inventory program showed that the United States had lost approximately half of its wetland acres. The classification used by the NWI program was based on a document called Classification of Wetlands and Deepwater Habitats of the United States by Cowardin et al. And the classification generally became known by the lead author's name, the Cowardin classification. NWI mapping was originally hand-drawn on mylar sheets and then copied onto black and white USGS topographic maps, as shown in these images. Today, NWI mapping has been digitized and is available to view or download through the NWI website, shown here. The data are constantly being updated across the country, though in small areas at a time, meaning the data range in age from the 1970s to the 2020s. While an imperfect dataset in many ways, it is the only wetland mapping product with national coverage based on a consistent classification system. For this reason, NWI mapping is the basis for most random sample designs used by the Riparian and Wetland AIM program. The Cowardin classification is hierarchical and consists of 3 levels: system, class, and water regime. The system level separates 5 different types of deep water habitats from vegetated systems. Remember that water bodies are included in NWI mapping. The class level below system identifies vegetation structure or substrate for non-vegetated systems. Finally, water regime describes the hydroperiod or timing and duration of flooding or saturation. There are 5 systems in the main Cowardin classification: marine, estuarine, lacustrine, riverine, and palustrine. In addition, a supplement to the classification added riparian for drier sites. But here is a catch. In the Cowardin classification, the lacustrine system is for the lake itself, not wetlands associated with lakes. Similarly, the riverine system is for the river itself, not wetlands associated with rivers. All vegetated wetlands with rooted vegetation are within the palustrine system, no matter where they are located. Everything we sample with the Riparian and Wetland AIM program will be within the palustrine system or the supplemental drier riparian system. This slide shows the hierarchy of the Cowardin classification within the palustrine system specifically. There are 8 classes within the palustrine system, which you can read from left to right. Those classes are rock bottom, unconsolidated bottom, aquatic bed, unconsolidated shore, moss lichen, emergent, scrub-shrub, and forested. Because the field protocol for lentic riparian and wetland systems focuses on vegetated wetlands, monitoring plots will typically only fall within 5 of the 8 classes: aquatic bed, moss lichen, emergent, scrub-shrub, and forested. The Cowardin classification also includes optional subclasses beneath each class, but those are not used in the Riparian and Wetland AIM protocol. In the blue box on this slide, you can see the water regimes and special modifiers, several of which are used in the protocol. The following slides will illustrate each of the 5 major Cowardin classes and discuss the water regimes and special modifiers. The aquatic bed class is for wetlands and deepwater habitats dominated by plants that grow principally on or below the surface of the water for most of the growing season in most years, like floating pondweed or pond lily. This class is possible for riparian and wetland AIM monitoring plots, but it is not common given the limit of deep water within our plots. Moss lichen class includes areas where mosses or lichen cover substrates other than rock. This class is found in the northern regions of the conterminous U.S. and in Alaska. For riparian and wetland aim, this class will only be used in Alaska. The emergent class is for wetlands characterized by erect, rooted herbaceous hydrophytes, excluding mosses and lichens. This vegetation is present for most of the growing season in most years. These wetlands are usually dominated by perennial plants. This class is very common for riparian and wetland aim monitoring plots. The scrub-shrub class is for wetlands dominated by woody vegetation that is less than 6 meters or 20 feet tall. Woody vegetation includes true shrubs, young trees or saplings, and trees or shrubs that are small or stunted due to environmental conditions. This class is also very common for riparian and wetland aim monitoring plots. The forested class is for wetlands dominated by woody vegetation that is 6 meters or 20 feet tall or taller. This class is possible for riparian and wetland aim monitoring plots, especially those on large floodplains, but is not as common as emergent or the scrub-shrub classes. Apologies for the next few text-heavy slides. This slide and the next list the 9 Cowardin water regimes, ordered from driest to wettest. Black text for each regime is the official description. Italics and underlining have been added to emphasize the words that differentiate each regime. Red text is added to provide examples of when the regime is used for riparian and wetland aim. The driest water regime is J, or intermittently flooded. For these wetlands, the substrate is usually exposed, but surface water is present for variable periods without detectable seasonal periodicity. Weeks, months, or even years may intervene between periods of inundation. The dominant plant communities under this water regime may change as soil moisture conditions change. This water regime is generally limited to the arid west. And this regime is used for playas and dry washes. It is stochastic, meaning flooding is tied to periodic weather events. This regime is possible, but not common for riparian and wetland aim. The next driest regime is A, or temporarily flooded. For these wetlands, surface water is present for brief periods during the growing season, but the water table usually lies well below the soil surface for most of the season. Plants that grow both in uplands and wetlands are characteristic of the temporarily flooded regime. This water regime is really for mesic meadows and drier floodplains. These sites are on the very edge of what would be considered wetland. The next water regime is B, or seasonally saturated. For these wetlands, the substrate is saturated at or near the surface for extended periods during the growing season, but unsaturated conditions prevail by the end of the season in most years. Surface water is typically absent, but may occur for a few days after heavy rains and upland runoff. This regime is for wet meadows that are groundwater fed, rather than flooded by a river or stream. The key to this regime is that the higher groundwater table recedes by the end of the growing season and is not persistent. The last water regime on this side is C, or seasonally flooded. For these wetlands, surface water is present for extended periods, especially early in the growing season, but is absent by the end of the season in most years. The water table after flooding ceases is variable, extending from saturated to the surface to a water table well below the ground surface. This regime of seasonally flooded is very common and is used for seasonally flooded meadows and riparian shrublets. The second slide on water regimes contains the wetter regimes, starting with D, or permanently saturated. For these wetlands, the substrate is saturated at or near the surface throughout the year in all or most years. Widespread surface inundation is rare, but water may be present in shallow depressions that intersect the groundwater table, particularly on a floating peat map. This regime is used for bogs, fens, muskegs, and some spring systems. Remember, this regime is differentiated from B, or seasonally saturated, because the saturation persists throughout the growing season. The next water regime is E, or seasonally flooded and saturated. For these wetlands, the surface water is present for extended periods of time, generally for more than a month, during the growing season, but is absent by the end of the season in most years. When surface water is absent, the substrate typically remains saturated at or near the surface. This regime is a mix of flooding and high groundwater and is used for floodplains with beaver influence or high groundwater discharge, particularly at higher elevations. The next is F, or semi-permanently flooded. For these wetlands, surface water persists throughout the growing season in most years. When surface water is absent, the water table is usually at or very near the land surface. This regime is used for stable marshes and large spring systems with surface water. This is the wettest regime typically used for wetlands. The last two regimes are generally not used for wetlands. They include G, or intermittently exposed. For these water bodies, surface water is present throughout the year, except in years of extreme drought. This is applied to large ponds and shallow lakes where the water does not appear likely to dry up. And H, permanently flooded. For these water bodies, water covers the substrate throughout the year in all years. This is mostly applied to deep water habitats, such as very large lakes, where there is no chance of drying. Both of these water regimes are for large ponds, lakes, and rivers that are not in the riparian and wetland aim target population. This last text-heavy slide contains the few Cowardin modifiers used in the riparian and wetland aim protocol. Beaver, or little b, includes wetlands created or modified by beaver. Partially drained or ditched, little d, is used for wetlands that have been altered hydrologically, but soil moisture is still sufficient to support hydrophytes. This modifier is also used to identify wetlands containing or connected to ditches. The partly drained and ditched modifier can be applied even if the ditches are too small to delineate separately. Excavated, or little x, is used to identify wetland basins or channels that were clearly excavated by humans. And diked or impounded, little h, is used for wetlands that have been created or modified by a man-made barrier or dam that obstructs the inflow or outflow of water. This last slide in the Part 1 presentation explains the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service riparian classification, which is a supplement to the standard Cowardin classification. The riparian classification was developed in 2009 for non-wetland areas that are drier than the Cowardin systems. If you remember from the presentation on defining the target population, there are two overlapping spheres that represent the concepts of wetland and riparian. The Cowardin classification covers all ecosystems within the wetland sphere, whether or not they are also overlap the concept of riparian. However, the Cowardin system does not include ecosystems that are only riparian and not wetland. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service developed the riparian supplement to the Cowardin classification for that slice of systems. What is important to remember is that even though this system is called riparian, it is reserved only for the non-wetland riparian areas, not all areas that would be considered riparian and connected to surface water bodies. The key is that these systems have no hydric soils. They are drier than true wetlands. Riparian codes within the Cowardin supplement start with RP and use the same class codes of emergent, scrub-shrub, and forested, but they do not include a water regime because they are drier than the Cowardin water regimes. This concludes part 1 of the presentation on classification and description. Thank you for listening.